"A loser," he said, and the word didn't just hang in the air. It shattered the golden light from the chandelier, sending splinters of silence right into my 76-year-old heart. I am Eleanor Thorne, and at 76, I've learned that the greatest weight in this life isn't carried in your hands, but in the things you leave unsaid. Most of my life has been spent building, not great skyscrapers, but foundations. I was a restoration architect, the kind who spends years crawling through dusty attics and under old floorboards, studying the bones of structures that everyone else had given up on. In the town of Port Haven, where the fog rolls in heavy and the century-old brick is perpetually damp with salt, some of my quietest, most meticulous work still stands. That evening, I wore a simple black cashmere cardigan and the silver locket my own mother gave me. I do not dress for applause, only for comfort. I walked into the Blue Anchor restaurant, a place where the waiters move like dancers and the wine list is longer than a short novel. The windows looked out over the Pacific, and the perpetual rhythm of the tide outside mixed with the low, careful music inside. My son, Adam, was already there, holding court. He's 42 now, but still possesses that youthful, arrogant grace, the kind that makes a man think his good fortune is a sign of his superiority. He was leaned back exactly as much as necessary to imply dominance without being rude. Beside him sat his wife, Claire, all angular beauty and sharp rings that caught the light like scattered ice, and across the table, impossibly poised, was George. My George, once upon a time, now simply George, a man whose memory sits in my past like a perfectly preserved but abandoned house. Next to him was his current wife, a younger woman named Delilah. George was talking about their new yacht, his voice a low, steady drone of success. Delilah listened with the practiced, glossy attention of someone who understood her role was to be decorative, a shimmering footnote to George's autobiography. The reason for this forced reunion, Adam had claimed, was to reconnect. I knew better. It was a victory lap. Adam's investment firm, Tideshore Ventures, had recently been featured in a regional magazine. A piece I had, ironically, ensured the magazine had the funds to print, though Adam didn't know it. I sat down, and the small, polite greetings were exchanged like trading fragile, unwanted gifts. Adam spent the first 30 minutes talking about projections, leveraging, and synergy. He spoke with the conviction of a man who genuinely believed he was creating wealth rather than simply moving it around. Claire, meanwhile, kept her hand on his forearm, adding details about their planned move to Miami. They spoke at me, never to me, using my silence as a sounding board for their own self-congratulations. George and Delilah offered small, approving nods, tacitly endorsing the idea that Adam's life was the correct version of a successful life. I watched the steam curl off my tea. I noticed the tiny hairline crack in the plaster ceiling, something only an architect would spot. I listened. I have always listened, finding the structural weaknesses in the grand pronouncements of men. Then George, ever the polished opportunist, leaned forward, addressing Adam but directing the barb at me. "Some people," George purred, looking pointedly at the antique bronze light fixture above our table, "spend their lives preserving things meant to be demolished. They deal in sentiment and rot. Others build futures. They understand scale. It was a dig at my life's work, my dedication to heritage and history, my refusal to engage in the high-stakes world of modern commercial architecture, the world George now dominated." Adam laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. Claire smiled too widely, and that's when the shift happened. The whole purpose of the dinner, which had been simmering beneath the rosemary butter and the expensive vintage, finally boiled over. Adam didn't just want to share his success. He wanted to validate it by tearing down mine. Adam stood, his chair scraping violently against the expensive hardwood floor. He lifted his glass, but instead of toasting the table, he pointed the rim directly at me. "To my mother," he announced, his voice carrying just enough to draw the attention of the nearby tables, "who reminds us all that sentiment is a trap. She never understood what it meant to win. She spent her life dealing in small, quiet things, mending the past instead of mastering the future." He paused, letting the silence inflate his ego before delivering the final strike, The phrase that started this entire retelling. A loser, he said, and the word didn't just hang in the air. It shattered the golden light from the chandelier, sending splinters of silence right into my 76-year-old heart. He looked at George, seeking approval. He looked at Claire, basking in her admiration. He did not look at me for long. The expression on his face was a mix of triumph and dismissal, as if he had just tidied a small, irrelevant corner of his life. I did not weep. I did not rage. I simply picked up my linen napkin, folded it meticulously into a small square, and placed it next to my unused teacup. I stood, nodding once, not in farewell, but in acknowledgement of a lesson finally learned, and walked out. The ocean air hit my face outside, sharp and cold, a shock to the system that cleared the heat from my chest. I drove home, the headlights cutting tunnels through the coastal fog. My old house, a sturdy, unpretentious farmhouse I'd restored myself 30 years ago, stands on a bluff. The wood is faded, the railings smooth with sea salt, but the foundation is granite, and the view is endless. I walked through the door into the kind of silence that feels less like emptiness and more like space. The quiet, waiting for a grand design. I hung my cardigan on the old, familiar hook by the back door and walked into my study. It's a small, square room filled with the things that truly last. Stacks of original blueprints, leather-bound histories of classical architecture, and a solid oak desk, worn smooth where my elbows have rested for decades. I sat down and let the quiet of the house, the low, distant song of the waves, begin to fill the hollowness Adam had tried to create. I thought about the boy who used to run to the driveway, his face alight with wonder when I showed him the sketches of a grand staircase or a truss. He used to sit in the very chair Adam had just insulted me from, tracing the lines of a Roman arch with his finger. The truth, which Adam had never been allowed to learn, was that I hadn't been avoiding scale. I had been providing it, just with an invisibility cloak of love. Adam's entire magnificent edifice was built not on his hard work, but on mine, laid 20 years prior. His firm, Tideshore Ventures, was a subsidiary of the much larger Cornerstone Trust. I, Eleanor Thorne, held the controlling shares through a shell company called Portico Holdings. And the penthouse he flaunted? It occupied the top floor of the old Port Haven Commerce Building. George and everyone else thought it was a new, high-end commercial tower. They didn't know I spent 10 years fighting to save that building from demolition, meticulously reinforcing the internal structure and designing the entire glass and steel facade that made it look contemporary. The building was owned by Archway Properties, another silent entity under the Cornerstone Trust. Adam's lease was conditional upon his status as a qualifying executive of Tideshore Ventures. I had never told him. I believed that pride of ownership, the illusion of self-made success, was what would grow him into a man. I thought if he felt the weight of his building, he would learn to respect all foundations. Instead, the illusion had inflated him, turning his genuine effort into mere entitlement. The armor he wore was not earned confidence. It was arrogance supplied on my expense account. That night, the grief for the distance between us felt heavier than any anger. I opened the bottom drawer of my oak desk and pulled out a simple ledger bound in canvas. Inside the front cover was a phone number. I picked up the receiver and dialed. The voice that answered belonged to Julian Reed, a former colleague from my restoration days who is now the sharpest corporate lawyer on the coast. He didn't ask why I was calling so late. He knew me too well. He simply waited. I spoke slowly, my voice low and steady. "Julian, it's time to activate the Keystone Protocol." There was a pause, a significant silence on the other end, the kind of stillness that precedes a great, irreversible collapse. "The Keystone, Eleanor? Are you certain?" "I am certain," I affirmed. "The Foundation has revealed itself. It cannot stand as it is," he understood. The Keystone Protocol was the final, carefully mapped-out contingency plan, a 3-day, non-negotiable sequence designed to dismantle Adam's entire lifestyle without a single word of confrontation from me. It would be quiet, swift, and undeniable. Before I tell you what happened next, I want you to stay with me. Subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It warms this old heart to know where my words travel. This is where the foundation of Adam's life began to crumble, plank by plank. The first day came with the rising of the sun and the ringing of Adam's phone. He was in his office at Tideshore Ventures when a certified letter was delivered to his desk. The letter, signed by a representative of Portico Holdings, the silent owner of Tideshore, announced an immediate, comprehensive internal compliance and financial audit. Effective immediately, all corporate accounts, credit lines, and asset purchasing power were frozen pending the review. Adam, I later learned from Julian, shouted through the glass walls of his office. He tried to call his corporate banker, who merely recited the terms of the holding company's master agreement, a document Adam had never bothered to read. He couldn't pay his vendors. He couldn't make payroll. Tideshore Ventures, the empire he boasted of building, seized up like a poorly maintained engine. George, his mentor, called him later that afternoon, angry. George's consulting fees, a significant monthly sum that paid for Delilah's expensive handbags, had not arrived. George had built his own livelihood on the assumption that Tideshore's cash flow was eternal. He demanded Adam fix it. Adam was left staring at a blank screen, the silence in his once bustling office suddenly oppressive. The fear in George's voice, the sheer entitlement of his panic, must have been a peculiar comfort in Adam's unraveling world, a reminder that his supposed mentor was just as dependent on assumed security. The second day focused on his chariot in Adam. Had to take an early meeting downtown, and when he stepped out of the Port Haven Commerce Building, keys in hand, his sleek, custom-ordered German sedan was gone. A polite, uniformed man from the leasing company stood on the curb holding a clipboard. He informed Adam that the lease on the vehicle, held by Archway Properties and contingent upon the driver being an actively trading executive of a profitable Portico Holdings subsidiary, was now terminated due to the audit status. The car was already on the tow truck. Adam was furious, pleading and arguing in the street. Claire, who had come to meet him, stood by the entrance, her designer sunglasses shielding eyes that were suddenly calculating the cost of the disaster. People noticed, of course. The entire spectacle was public, quick, and humiliating. Adam, stripped of his gilded transportation, had to hail a cab. The world hadn't helped him, just watched. I spent those 2 days at home. I wasn't watching the spectacle, but working in my garden, trimming back the wild, sprawling blackberry bushes that had tried to take over the porch steps. I worked slowly, clipping and shaping, thinking of how easily growth could become overgrowth, how boundaries were necessary not just for structures, but for people. The third day was the final act, focused on the symbol of his status, the penthouse. Adam and Claire were given formal notice from a representative of Archway Properties. The terms of the residency were clear. Continued occupation of the top-floor unit was granted only while Adam maintained his qualifying executive status at Tideshore Ventures. With the audit ongoing and Tideshore essentially defunct, that status was revoked. They were given 72 hours to vacate. It was all very quiet, very efficient. No shouting, no drama. Just the slow, methodical emptying of a magnificent space. Claire, I was told, spent the entire morning on the edge of their white sofa, hands pressed to her temples, making frantic calls that went nowhere. Adam packed. He folded his expensive clothes and placed them into suitcases, the image of his self-made success dissolving around him. I waited. The tide came in and went out. Adam arrived on a late Friday afternoon, just as the light was turning that liquid, soft gold that happens right before sunset over the ocean. I heard the sound of the engine, not the deep, powerful roar of his previous sedan, but the strained, slightly off-key sound of an older borrowed coupe. He sat in the car for a long time, shoulders slumped before stepping out. His steps on the gravel path were heavy and uncertain. He looked like a man who had lost his skin. I opened the front door before he could knock. I didn't smile, but I didn't look stern either. I simply stepped aside and waved him in. The house smelled of cedar, old paper, and the constant, patient salt of the sea. He followed me to my study. He sat down in the wooden chair across from my desk, the the same chair where he had sat as a boy, learning about the principle of load-bearing walls. The shelves lined with engineering manuals and the framed blueprints of my life's work seemed to press in on him. He spoke first, his voice thin and hollow, a contrast to the booming confidence he'd displayed at the restaurant. "Mom," he began, and the words sounded like a question. I don't understand how everything could fall apart so fast. The ground it wasn't there." I listened, letting the silence settle like dust motes in the warm light. I watched the water from my window, letting him see that I was not rushed. When he finished, I finally spoke, my voice low and level. "Nothing fell apart, Adam. The ground didn't disappear. The foundation simply revealed itself." And then I told him. I explained the Cornerstone Trust, Portico Holdings, and Archway Properties. I explained that Tideshore Ventures was always a subsidiary, a carefully structured vessel designed to give him the illusion of control. I told him the penthouse was mine, that the entire Commerce Building was the culmination of 10 years of my quiet restoration work. The SUV was leased in my name. He absorbed each truth like a blow, his face growing paler with every stone of fact I placed in his hands. He didn't argue or shout. He simply looked utterly, profoundly hollow, as if the image he had carried of himself had evaporated entirely. "Why did you hide it?" he finally whispered. "Why all the elaborate deception?" I leaned forward, resting my hands on the smooth, worn oak of my desk. "I didn't hide it to deceive you, Adam. I hid it because I wanted you to build on your own terms. I wanted you to feel the pride of walking into a room knowing your worth came from your effort, not my provision. But I gave too much and I asked for nothing in return. I thought love meant providing without question. I see now that love also requires structure. Without boundaries, what we build, whether it's a house or a life, becomes too soft to stand." His eyes lowered. He admitted, in a broken voice, that he had been mimicking George. "I thought George was showing me how to be strong," he confessed. I nodded. "George has his own story, Adam. He grew up counting pennies, told he would never amount to anything. When he found success, he didn't use it to build. He used it to buy armor. His arrogance isn't pride. It's fear. The fear of ever having to return to the small, inadequate man he once was. You learn to wear that armor without ever understanding the wound beneath it." He looked up, tears finally filling his eyes. "Do you hate me?" "No," I told him quietly. "Hatred is loud and sharp. What I feel is grief. Grief for the years lost, the distance that grew between us, the time we both misunderstood what the other needed. But grief doesn't mean an ending. It means there was something worth mourning, and that means there is something worth rebuilding." I stood and walked to the window, watching the last sliver of the sun dip into the ocean. I am not offering a quick return or an easy repair, Adam. I am offering a beginning. You will need to live within your means, rent an apartment you can afford, and find work that pays what your effort truly earns. You must build slowly, honestly, from ground level, the way solid structures and men are meant to be built. He nodded silently, his shoulders still slumped, but perhaps less tense. The silence that filled the study now was different from the strained quiet of the restaurant. This silence was restorative. It made space. A chapter had closed, harsh and unforgiving, but a new page was finally blank. He had stepped through the open door. A year passed. It moved with the quiet, steady rhythm of the tide, always moving, even when no one is watching. I spent my late afternoons on the porch, where the granite foundation kept the house firm against the ocean winds. I was used to the stillness now, a profound solitude that felt like peace, not loneliness. One afternoon, when the light was that soft golden hue, I heard a car. It was nothing special, a well-maintained four-door that pulled in without fanfare. The door shut with a gentle click. Adam walked around the corner of the porch. His clothes were different, a clean, simple work shirt, faded jeans. But it wasn't the clothes that mattered. It was the way he carried himself. His posture was no longer reaching for attention. His eyes didn't search the porch for approval. He carried himself like a man who had felt the earth move beneath him, fallen, and stood back up using nothing but his own 2 feet. He didn't ask permission. He simply walked up the steps and sat in the chair beside mine. We sat and watched the ocean. The gulls wheeled and cried. The water was endless. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, without a hint of the frantic salesman I had met at the restaurant. He told me he was working at a small, independent surveying firm inland. The work was demanding, the pay modest, but the projects were real, subdivisions and utility lines that served actual people. "It feels good to come home at the end of the day. Mom," he said, looking out at the water, "knowing I actually earned the dollar. I have a small place now, enough for what I need." He paused, but this time he wasn't waiting for shame. He was simply stating a fact. I nodded, not in praise, just in simple, quiet recognition. There are moments that demand no speeches. They only need to be witnessed. After a while, we walked down the path toward the shoreline. At the edge of the property, there was a small wooden footbridge, a little span I had designed decades ago to cross a narrow, rocky crevice. The wood had begun to rot where it met the damp, salted stone. I had been meaning to fix it for months. Adam stopped, assessed the damage with a thoughtful frown, and picked up one end of a loose plank. "The ledger needs replacing," he said, not asking, but observing. He held the damaged plank steady while I fetched new boards, screws, and my tools from the shed. We worked without talking much, the rhythmic sound of the hammer meeting the wood mingling with the crash of the waves. Our rhythm returned easily, a partnership forged not in entitlement, but in shared effort. The sun lowered, painting the sky in strokes of pink and amber. Adam wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, a smear of dirt across his cheek, and leaned against the newly reinforced railing. I looked at him, not as the boy I had indulged, but as the man standing beside me now, as I stood there, watching him test the strength of the span we had just mended together. I finally understood the deepest lesson of architecture and of love. Love is not always soft. Sometimes love is the distance that prevents harm. Sometimes love is the firm boundary you hold, even when every instinct tells you to step over it. And sometimes love is simply waiting, not with hope or expectation, but with patience, trusting that a person will eventually find their own way back to the sturdy, honest structure of themselves. The tide rolled in. The porch light behind us glowed faintly in the gathering dusk. We stood on the mended span, silent, until the first star appeared.